There's a number I try not to cross when I price vintage for my shop, and it's not a feeling, it's a percentage. If we haven't met before, I'm Carol. I am not an expert on selling on Etsy, and I specifically want to separate myself from other Etsy-focused YouTubers who are experts. They probably are. I just share what's worked for me. Lately, I have had a lot of questions about pricing, and I thought it was worth devoting an entire video to this rather than trying to squeeze it into my Q&A video that's coming out later this month. Not just what I price things at, but how I decide whether a price is good before I ever list an item, as well as how I judge the success of my pricing after something is sold. And I will say up front that I don't go through this equation business every time I list something. Once I price this way for a while, I learned from experience what prices will bring me the margin that I'm aiming to get from the sale of an item. What I'm showing you today is a starting point for pricing that is set with an end gross margin in mind. And after a while, this approach helped me with knowing what I could source items for as well, and I'll show you an example of that later too. Now, before I talk about percentages or tiers, I want to explain why I don't use net profit to guide my pricing decisions. And this might seem confusing at first, but stick with me, I'll try to explain it. Most people are taught to look at net profit. That's what's left after everything is paid. And net profit absolutely matters to your business in the long run and for so many other reasons. But it's very difficult to predict net profit when you're pricing individual vintage items because so many things can differ from one sale to the next, even for items sourced and priced exactly the same way. Now, as I've said before, I do use calculated shipping, so customers pay for the postage, which removes an entire variable for me. So I won't be saying anything about shipping costs. But net profit still moves around more than people would expect, and that's what I want to show you here on this handy dandy slide that I worked on for much longer than you would expect. Math is not my strong point, so I've had to check and recheck probably more than most people would to make sure that what I'm showing you is correct. But let's look at the slide, and we're going to start in the middle, what I've framed. Okay, start in the middle of this slide, how the price is set. I want to start in the middle because this is how I price in the first place. If I pay, and I'll explain how to do this later, so just go with it for now. If I pay $12 for an item and I want a 70% gross margin, this is the math I'm using. $12 divided by 1 minus 70% or 0.7 gives me a $40 list price. Now that $40 is not random, it's intentional. This is the decision that happens before the item is listed. Okay, now let's look at what happens after one of these items sells. We're going to look on the left and see about this vase. Now I paid theoretically the same thing for the vase and the butter dish, but let's just look at the sale of the vase. It's a pretty simple sale. It sold for $40. There was no coupon used, no sales, no offsite ads. And after the cost of the item and Etsy's regular fees, and I'm not counting that 20 cents listing fee, that would be really hard to predict, the net profit is $23.75. That works out to about a 59% net profit margin before shipping supplies, and this is theoretical because I never use the shipping supplies cost in figuring out net profit for any individual sale. Instead, we deduct the year's worth of shipping supplies when we're calculating our shop's net profit for the year. So sorry for that aside, I just wanted to clarify. So far, so good. That's exactly what I expect when I price this way. Now, if we look over at the right side of this graphic, the butter dish, this is where real life comes in. So it was the same cost of goods sold, and I used the same method to set the list price of $40. But this time the customer used a 10% coupon, and the sale came through an off-site ad. So the actual sale price drops to $36. And after the same cost of goods and Etsy's fees based on $36, not $40, and the off-site ad based on $36, the net profit comes down to $15.81. And that puts the net profit margin closer to 44%. So both the vase and the butter dish were sourced for $12. They were both listed for $40. But what happened for each sale was different, and it affected the net profit margin. And this happens because of coupons. It happens because of sales, being on sale, that is, not just a sale, or maybe even a partial refund that I might give down the road. This is why I find net profit is really hard to use as a pricing guide. I simply cannot know when I'm listing something if someone is going to use a coupon, buy an item when I'm running a sale, or if an off-site ad will even bring in the sale. This is why I rely on gross margin to guide my pricing, because there aren't a bunch of variables and it is comparable across items. Coupons and off-site ads don't affect the gross margin calculation itself. They happen after pricing and sourcing decisions have already been made. They do absolutely affect net profit, just not gross margin. Before all of the variables get applied, I use gross margin for my pricing and to judge my pricing success after a sale to help me price items before I list them, and to reassure myself after a sale that I priced the item responsibly in the first place. Because gross margin is less affected by point of sale variables, I can consistently compare items and know whether they're helping my business be sustainable. Now, I have a column on my inventory spreadsheets that my husband has set up with an equation. There are a lot of columns and a lot of equations, but one specifically figures out gross margin for each individual item that I sell. So, what gross margin is good? I aim for a 60 to 90% plus gross margin when I'm pricing and listing items. Do I hit 60% on everything? No. But I sell enough items at 70, 80, and 90% plus to make up for the items that don't. And also occasionally have items that I've sourced at a very low price, like maybe $1 at a garage sale or something like that. And I don't use this strategy for that, because if I put a 60% profit margin price on an item I source for $1, that would mean I price it for $2.50, and that is just ridiculous. I wouldn't waste my time with something that low price. Customer is not going to buy something that they have to pay more shipping for than the price of, so I just stay away from that. But those really low priced items are the exception, not the rule. Now, is this a perfect system? Probably not. Do other sellers calculate pricing differently? Absolutely. I'm not sharing this because I think everyone should do it my way, but because every seller needs a consistent method, and this consistent method works for me as a non-expert. If an item isn't going to generate enough profit to sustain my business, it probably isn't worth sourcing in the first place. Now, once gross margin became my anchor for pricing, my next question was pretty obviously, how much margin is enough? And that's where I'm calling them tiers because I can't think of a better word for it, but I have tiers of pricing. So 60, 70 to 80, and 90% plus gross margin. And I think about these in 3 simple tiers. So the 60% is the floor. The 70 to 80% is the sweet spot, and 90% plus is the home run, a really good and great. Gross margin equals the gross profit expressed as a percentage. It is real profit generated by the item before all the operating expenses are accounted for. So when you say this item has a 60% gross margin, you're saying this item generated a 60% profit on the sale before business expenses. Likewise, like 70% gross margin means the item produced 70% profit before the business expenses are figured. It is not your end profit. Remember, expenses still need to be subtracted. I just find it the most comparable number that I can refer to for my pricing decisions across the board. So the 60% gross margin, this is the lowest gross margin that I want to see in my shop. And if I had a whole shop of 60% gross margin priced items, I probably wouldn't be able to stay in business. This is where it's nice to have an idea of maximum prices to pay for something. If you want a 60, 70, 80, 90% gross margin, when I'm sourcing a list like the one I have available in my Etsy shop for vintage resellers, check it out if you think something like that would be helpful for you. It's not rocket science. It's just lists of prices that I have put together to help you see if I pay this much for it, I should be able to get this much gross profit margin. Now, there is an exception to me pricing this way, and I will get to that. You're going to have to hang on to the end, though. My sweet spot is 70 to 80% gross margin. This is where I want most of my shop to live. So, simply put, at 70 to 80% gross margin, the business runs smoothly. These items cover the routine and often unexpected costs, like an occasional full refund that I have to give to a customer if something breaks in the mail. This allows me to not be nervous when something goes wrong. So if 60% keeps the doors open in my shop, 70 to 80% keeps the business calm and sustainable. Now, once in a while, I'll have a home run item. That's where I make a 90% or plus gross margin. And remember, these are things that I've sourced at a very low price. They're the bonuses, not the expectation. So in simple terms, at 90% or higher, the item is making up for those items that, because of coupons, offsite ads, anything else that could happen, slip below the 60% profit margin plus. Now, these are usually items from garage sales, thrift stores, bazaars, even items that people give me to just sell. Not usually the items that I'm sourcing at antique stores. Now, I don't chase these kinds of sales, and I don't usually intentionally price something that high unless I've sourced it very low. And I certainly recognize when they happen when I'm filling in my inventory sheets after a sale. Now, once I know where an item needs to land as far as pricing, the next step is figuring out the minimum price that gets me there. And that's where the math comes in. Now, let's look at this second graphic that I made. So, this pricing equation is to calculate specific prices that will yield the specific gross margin that I am seeking. And here's the equation. Cost of goods sold divided by, and notice this is in parentheses, so this is a two-step equation. 1 minus the target gross margin. And that is the minimum listing price to charge if I want a specific gross margin. And here are the examples. So I hope that this helps you to understand it if you're interested in trying this. So to price an item that I sourced for $14 and I would like a 60% gross margin, here is the equation. 14 divided by 1 minus 60% or 0.60. And then I simplify that equation to 14 divided by 0.4 and that's $35. So I'm going to list that item at $35 if I want a 60% gross margin. Now, say the same item, I want a 70% gross margin. So the equation then is 14 divided by 1 minus 70%, or 0.70. I simplify that to 14 divided by 0.3, and it gives me not a round number, so I round it to 47, and that list price would be $47. Next, if I've got this same item and I'm like, oh, I want to get an 80% gross margin on this one, 14 divided by 1 minus 80%, or 0.80. Simplified to 14 divided by 0.2, and that comes out to 70. So I would list the item at $70. I will put these examples down in the description in case you want to look at them further. But that's it. No complicated math, no guessing, no back solving after the sale. I just figure whatever the gross margin is that I'm aiming for, use the same equation with a different variable for the percentage. So after I had done this for a while, because I know right now a lot of you are thinking, oh, I can't do that equation every time I have something to price. Well, I found that it helped me know that what I could pay for something when I was sourcing, and it gave me a really good idea of what to price things that I had sourced for certain amounts. You don't have to keep doing this equation over and over. It's going to become ingrained. Those prices anyway, maybe not the equation, but the answers to the equation will get ingrained in your mind. So I'm going to show you one more graphic, and this is to illustrate an item that I sell over and over again in my shop. It's my best-selling wedding cake topper. And I know instinctively now what I can afford to pay for this in order to get the price I want to get for it in my shop when I sell it. See, I don't price to hope that I make money. I price so the math already says I will. Okay, so I guess I actually made two slides here because I didn't want to put too much on one slide and get you confused. But this, the last one of these that I purchased for my shop, I actually purchased up in Ocala a couple weeks ago. I paid $10 for this little wedding cake topper. And I bet I've sold 30 of these over the last 3 years. They're very popular. Now, I paid $10 for it. 10 divided by 1 minus 0.60 for the 60% simplifies to 10 divided by 0.4. That comes out to $25. But you can see there, I sell those for $28. That's what I've always sold it for. I think that's the best price for it. So you know right away, I'm making a little more than 60%. Now look at this second slide. So the second slide looks much like the first slide, but I've got some additional information, and this would be information from after I've made the sale. So just like on the left side, I'm showing you from the back end, cost of goods sold was $10. So the selling price minus the cost of goods sold divided by the selling price, 18 divided by 28 is about 64%. So when I sell this little figurine at $28, I'm making about a 64% gross margin. Now look at this. If I can find this figurine for $6, look how my gross margin increases to 71%. If I can find it for $4 or $5, it goes up even higher. So you can see how this can help you in figuring and planning on what you can pay for an item when you source it. I decide what I can afford before I list so that discounts don't make me nervous later. I don't price to hope I make money. I price so that the math already says I will. If you're interested in trying this pricing approach, the price floor that is right for your shop is the first thing that you want to figure out. And if you want a simple place to start, track the gross margin on your next 5 items. That alone will change how you source and how you price. Now, I've been saying throughout the video that I would tell you the one exception to this at the end of the video. And here it is, the one exception. And I try to not have this happen too often. But if I calculate a 60% gross margin price, and that is higher, significantly higher than I would pay for that item if I was looking to buy it, then I throw caution to the wind and I price it at what I would pay for it, and I count it as a lesson learned. Realize I'm not losing money at this point. I'm just more or less sourcing it for the buyer without making the profit that my shop needs to make. Fortunately, this doesn't happen very often, and on average, I probably sell enough items at 70% or more gross margin to make up for an occasional strikeout. I hope all this made sense for you. I shared this not because I think everyone should be calculating their prices the way I do, but more to emphasize that you need to be thinking about how you price your items consistently with profit in mind. Because if you don't really have a business. You have a hobby with receipts. Thanks for being here today.